The flash of 100 cameras can feel like a spotlight or an interrogation lamp. For Audrey Davenport, standing on the marble floor of the Grand Astoria ballroom, it was a firing squad. Her husband, the tech billionaire John Davenport, a man who could build empires with a single phone call, was about to destroy her with a single sentence. He draped his arm around his mistress, the stunning and ruthless Sabrina Valenti, and sneered at his own pregnant wife. In front of the city's elite, he declared, "Look at her. What good is she, utterly useless?" The words echoed a public execution of her dignity. But what no one in that room knew, not even John himself, was that destiny was about to make its own declaration. That very night, a secret would be revealed, a will would be read, and the woman he called useless would inherit the power to destroy them all. The Grand Astoria Charity Gala was the apex of the city's social calendar, a glittering spectacle where fortunes were pledged and reputations were made or mercilessly broken. For Audrey Davenport, it had always felt less like a party and more like a performance. Tonight, the performance was agony. The bespoke silk gown, a deep sapphire blue meant to complement her eyes, felt like a shroud clinging uncomfortably to the gentle swell of her 5-month pregnancy. The diamonds at her throat felt like a collar. John, her husband, was in his element. He moved through the throng of politicians, investors, and socialites with the predatory grace of a shark navigating its own reef. John Davenport hadn't just built Davenport Innovations. He had forged it from nothing, fueled by a relentless ambition that left little room for sentiment. He was brilliant, charismatic, and cruel in equal measure. In the early days of their marriage, Audrey had mistaken his intensity for passion. Now, 2 years in, she knew it for what it was, a fire that warmed only himself and scorched everything else. She stood by a towering ice sculpture of a swan, trying to appear serene, a placid smile fixed on her face. She could feel the whispers, the sideways glances. They saw her as John's greatest mystery, the quiet, unassuming art historian he'd married in a whirlwind romance. They didn't see the woman who managed his chaotic home life, who curated the art that made their penthouse a sanctuary, who remembered the birthdays of his employees' children, and who was carrying his heir. To them, and increasingly to John, she was merely a decorative object, one that was beginning to lose its shine. Then she saw him with Sabrina Valenti. Sabrina was the COO of a rival tech firm, a woman as sharp and polished as cut glass. She was everything Audrey was not: fiercely ambitious, publicly celebrated, and unapologetically carnal. She wore a crimson dress that seemed poured onto her body, her laughter loud and confident as she hung on John's arm. They weren't hiding. They were flaunting. Audrey felt a familiar cold dread seep into her bones. She had known about the affair for months. It was an open secret, another tool John used to remind her of her place. But tonight felt different. There was a finality in the air, a sense of an ending. Her friend Olivia, a gallery owner with a no-nonsense attitude, materialized at her side. "Audrey, don't just stand there and take this," she hissed, her eyes flashing with anger. "That woman is practically branding him with her lipstick. Let's go." "And go where Olivia," Audrey murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "This is my life. This who is gilded, but the bars are still iron." As if summoned by their conversation, John and Sabrina began to walk toward them, a path parting before them, as if they were royalty. John's smile was wide, but it didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Darling," he began the endearment, a poisoned dart. Sabrina was just telling me about her company's new acquisition. Fascinating stuff. The kind of aggressive, forward-thinking strategy that builds empires. He paused, his gaze sweeping over Audrey's pregnant form with undisguised disdain. It requires a certain dynamism, a usefulness. Sabrina's smile was a masterpiece of condescending pity. Oh, John, be nice. Audrey has other priorities now. She gestured vaguely at Audrey's stomach. Domesticity is a full-time job, I suppose. The air crackled with unspoken venom. The circle of onlookers grew tighter, sensing blood in the water. This was better than the charity auction. This was real-life drama. Audrey straightened her spine. I'm sure it is, she said, her voice quiet but clear. Just as I'm sure running a home, managing a staff of 15, and planning events like the one that secured your last round of funding is more than just domesticity. John's face darkened. He hated being challenged, especially by her. He saw it as a malfunction in his perfectly ordered world. He took a step closer, lowering his voice into a menacing growl that only those nearest could hear. Don't you dare pretend that what you do is anything more than spending my money. He then turned to the wider audience, his voice booming with theatricality. He draped his arm possessively around Sabrina's waist, pulling her flush against him. You see this woman, he declared, gesturing to Sabrina. This is power. This is a partner. Someone who contributes, who builds. Then he turned his hand palm open in Audrey's direction. The gesture was one of dismissal, of utter contempt. And then you have this, he said, his voice dripping with scorn. The cameras, which had been documenting the event, now zoomed in their flashes merciless. I ask you, what good is she? She reads books and buys flowers. While we're out here changing the world, she's nesting. She's utterly and completely useless. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was brutal. It was a public stoning with words as rocks. Sabrina preened under the attention, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. Olivia looked ready to commit murder, but Audrey simply stood there, the world dissolving into a blur of flashing lights and distorted faces. The smile on her face didn't crack. It froze. She felt the tiny flutter of life inside her, a secret strength that they couldn't see. She held John's gaze for a long moment, and in her eyes he didn't see tears or anger. He saw a profound and unnerving emptiness, as if he had finally irrevocably broken something he could never fix. Without another word, she turned. Head held high, she walked through the silent, gawking crowd past the ice swan and out of the ballroom. The clicking of her heels on the marble floor was the only sound, a steady, rhythmic beat counting down the final hours of John Davenport's reign. The ride home to the sprawling penthouse apartment that overlooked the city was a silent, surreal journey. The driver, a kind man named Hector, whom Audrey had known for 2 years, kept his eyes fixed on the road, his silence a respectful acknowledgement of her pain. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red through the rain-streaked window, a vibrant, living world that felt 1,000,000 miles away from the frozen tundra of her heart. The apartment, usually a source of comfort, felt alien and hostile. Every piece of art she had so carefully chosen, every silk cushion she had arranged, seemed to mock her. They were part of the useless life John had so publicly decried. She walked through the cavernous living room, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. "It's just us now, little one," she whispered to the unborn child. "I don't know what we're going to do, but we are not useless." She went into the master bedroom, a space they had once shared, and began to pack a small bag. Not with designer clothes or jewelry, but with essentials. Her mother's locket, a worn copy of her favorite book of poetry, the first ultrasound picture. She was done. The public humiliation was not an isolated incident. It was the crescendo of a long and painful symphony of emotional cruelty. The pregnancy had made her hopeful that he might change, that the prospect of a child would soften the jagged edges of his ambition. She now saw how foolish that had been. To him, the baby was just another acquisition, a legacy. The vessel carrying it was incidental. She called Olivia. "I'm leaving him," she said, her voice raw but firm. "Thank God," Olivia breathed into the phone. "Where will you go?" "Come stay with me. My spare room is a mess, but it's safe." "Thank you. I will," Audrey said, a single tear finally tracing a path down her cheek. "I just need to get a few things and I'll be there." As she was about to close her suitcase, her phone rang. It was an unknown number. She ignored it. It rang again, persistent. Annoyed, she answered, ready to snap at a telemarketer. "Mrs. Davenport," a calm, professional voice asked. "Who is this?" "This is Detective Miller with the City Police Department. Are you the wife of John Davenport?" Audrey's blood ran cold. "Yes. Has something happened?" "Ma'am, I'm afraid I have some bad news. There's been an incident. Your husband, Mr. Davenport, has passed away." The world tilted on its axis. The suitcase slipped from her hand, its contents spilling onto the plush carpet. "What? No. That's not possible. He was at the gala. I just left him an hour ago." "Is this some kind of sick joke?" "I'm very sorry, ma'am. It's no joke," the detective said, his voice gentle but firm. "He left the gala shortly after you did. His driver reported that Mr. Davenport was agitated and insisted on being taken to his office. About 20 minutes ago, the night security guard found him. It appears he suffered a sudden, massive coronary event. The paramedics were on site within minutes, but they were unable to revive him. I'm so sorry for your loss." Audrey sank to the floor, the phone still pressed to her ear. She couldn't process the words. John. Dead. The man who had seemed so indestructible, so full of brutal, vibrant life, was gone. The titan of industry, the man who bent the world to his will, had been felled by a flaw in his own heart. The irony was so staggering, it was almost poetic. She felt a wave of conflicting emotions, shock, a strange, hollow grief for the man he once was, and a terrifying, liberating sense of freedom. The cage door had just swung open. "Mrs. Davenport, are you still there?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice a ghost of itself. "Yes, I'm here. We will need you to come down to the city morgue to make a formal identification. You can bring someone with you if you'd like." "I understand," she said numbly. "I'll be there." After hanging up, she sat on the floor for a long time, surrounded by the scattered remnants of her planned escape. Her escape had come, but not in the way she had ever imagined. The man who had called her useless just an hour ago was now a piece of paperwork, a case file, a body waiting in a cold room. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from a number she didn't recognize. The message was short and chilling. "This isn't over. Don't think for a second you've won." Audrey knew instantly who it was from. Sabrina. The battle for John's affection was over, but a new war, a war for his empire, was just beginning. And Audrey, the useless wife, was standing alone in the heart of a battlefield. The 24 hours following Detective Miller's call were a maelstrom of muted chaos. Audrey moved as if in a dream, performing the necessary rituals of the newly bereaved. She identified John's body in the sterile, silent morgue, a task that felt both intimately personal and coldly bureaucratic. Seeing his face so recently twisted with scorn, now slack and pale in death, didn't evoke tears. It evoked a profound sense of waste. All that fire, all that drive extinguished. When she returned to the penthouse, she found Sabrina Valenti already there. She was in the living room, a glass of John's best scotch in her hand, talking on her phone in low, urgent tones. She had changed from her crimson gown into a sharp black power suit. She looked less like a grieving mistress and more like a corporate raider staking her claim. "I don't care what the preliminary report says, get our own people in there," Sabrina was saying. "I want to know everything. His financials, his private communications, any recent changes to his portfolio." She saw Audrey and ended the call without a goodbye. "What are you doing here, Sabrina?" Audrey asked, her voice flat. Exhaustion had stripped away her capacity for emotional displays. "I'm grieving Audrey, just like you," Sabrina said, her tone laced with insincerity. "John and I, we had a deep connection. He would have wanted me here. He would have wanted his private," Audrey countered, walking past her toward the kitchen. "Something you seem determined to violate even in his death." "This is bigger than privacy now," Sabrina shot back, following her. "This is about his legacy. Davenport Innovations is vulnerable. The board is in a panic. The stock will plummet when the markets open. Someone needs to take control to show strength. And you've nominated yourself for the role. Someone has to. You can't possibly think you're capable of it." The word hung in the air between them, useless. Before Audrey could respond, the penthouse doorbell chimed. It was Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, her face a mask of genuine sorrow. Behind her stood a tall, impeccably dressed man in his late 60s, with piercing grey eyes and a somber expression. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Davenport," Mrs. Gable said, her voice thick with emotion. "This gentleman insisted on seeing you. He says it's urgent." The man stepped forward, offering a gloved hand. "Mrs. Davenport, my name is Gareth Finch. I was your husband's personal attorney and the executor of his estate. My deepest condolences for your loss." Audrey shook his hand. It was cold and firm. "Mr. Finch, thank you for coming." Finch's gaze flickered to Sabrina, his expression unreadable but distinctly disapproving. "I need to speak with you alone, Mrs. Davenport." "Anything you have to say to her, you can say to me," Sabrina interjected, stepping forward. "I was John's closest confidant." Finch turned his cool gaze upon her. "Ms. Valenti, my legal duty is to my client's widow and his estate. My client's confidants are not a party to this conversation. I must insist." His tone was polite, but carried the unyielding weight of law. Sabrina's eyes narrowed, but she retreated, moving back to the living room window to stare out at the city, a predator waiting for a new opportunity to strike. Mr. Finch led Audrey to the study, a room panelled in dark mahogany and lined with books John had never read. He closed the door firmly. "Mrs. Davenport," he began, his voice low. "I know this is a terrible time, but we must act quickly. Your husband's passing has created a power vacuum, and nature, especially corporate nature, abhors a vacuum." "Sabrina seems eager to fill it," Audrey said tiredly. "As does Walter Kendrick and at least 2 other board members," Finch confirmed. "They are already maneuvering. That is why I am here. John had a very specific set of instructions for me in the event of his untimely death. He was, a man who planned for every contingency. What kind of instructions? He stipulated that his last will and testament be read to all pertinent parties within 48 hours of his death, no exceptions. It is highly irregular, but the instruction is ironclad. Audrey was taken aback. 48 hours? Why the rush? I believe John understood the chaos his death would unleash, Finch said carefully. He wanted to quell it, to make his final wishes unequivocally clear before the sharks could begin a feeding frenzy. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. The reading will take place tomorrow at 10 a.m. sharp in the main conference room at the Davenport Innovations Tower. I have already dispatched summonses to the required attendees. Who is required to attend? Finch consulted a list. You, of course. His brother, Desmond Davenport. His estranged sister, Mary Ann. A few senior executives, including Mr. Kendrick. And... He paused, his expression hardening almost imperceptibly. He also specifically named Ms. Sabrina Valenti. Audrey felt a fresh wave of nausea. John was going to humiliate her from beyond the grave, likely leaving a token of his affection and power to his mistress in front of everyone. It was exactly the kind of cruel theater he would have orchestrated. I see, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Davenport, Finch said, his gaze softening for the first time. I have worked for John for 20 years. I have seen him at his best and at his absolute worst. Whatever happens tomorrow, I urge you to maintain your composure. Listen carefully, and do not underestimate your husband. He was the most complex man I have ever known. With that cryptic warning, the lawyer departed, leaving Audrey in the silent, book-lined room. The storm was no longer gathering. It had arrived. Tomorrow, in that cold glass tower, the future of a billion-dollar empire would be decided. And she was walking into it, completely blind, armed with nothing but the memory of her husband's final, brutal insult. The main conference room at Davenport Innovations was on the 50th floor, a sterile expanse of glass and chrome that offered a godlike view of the city below. It was a room designed for power plays and corporate bloodshed, and at 10 a.m. the next morning, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke on. Audrey sat at the head of the long, polished obsidian table. She had chosen a simple, high-necked black dress, a stark contrast to the couture mourning attire of the others. She felt Mr. Finch's advice echoing in her mind, maintain your composure. She sat straight-backed, her hands resting calmly on her pregnant belly, her expression a mask of serene neutrality. To her right sat John's family. His brother Desmond, a soft-bodied man with a perpetually aggrieved expression who had long lived in John's financial shadow. His sister Mary Ann, a brittle woman who hadn't spoken to John in 5 years after a bitter fight over their parents' inheritance. They both looked at Audrey with a mixture of pity and resentment. Across the table sat the corporate faction. Walter Kendrick, the company's CFO, a sleek, silver-haired man whose ambition was a poorly kept secret. Next to him, radiating a smug confidence that set Audrey's teeth on edge, was Sabrina Valenti. She had dressed for the part of the grieving but powerful successor in a tailored black suit with a blood-red blouse underneath. She met Audrey's gaze with a look that was pure triumph. She believed this was her coronation. Gareth Finch stood at a lectern at the far end of the room, the sealed envelope from John in his hand. He cleared his throat, and a heavy silence fell over the room. We are gathered here today, Finch began, his voice formal and resonant, to hear the last will and testament of John Edward Davenport, executed on the 2nd of March this year. Audrey's breath caught. March 2nd. That was 6 months ago. Long before the recent public escalation of his affair with Sabrina. Long before last night's brutal display. What could he have been thinking then? "I will dispense with the legal formalities and proceed to the bequests," Finch continued. He broke the wax seal on the envelope with a decisive crack. He started with the smaller items. To his brother, Desmond, John left a trust fund of $5 million with the strict stipulation that it be managed by a third party. Enough to live comfortably, Finch read from the will, but not enough to squander on your typically disastrous business ventures. Desmond's face turned a blotchy red. To his sister Mary Ann, he left their ancestral family home. "Which you always coveted more than my affection," the will read. "May its empty rooms bring you the solace you could never find in family." Mary Ann let out a small, strangled sob. Even in death, John's cruelty was precise. Next came the corporate bequests. Several loyal, long-serving executives received generous stock options and bonuses. Walter Kendrick sat up straighter, a hungry look in his eyes. "To Walter Kendrick," Finch read, "I leave my sincere gratitude for your years of service, my collection of vintage watches, and a recommendation for a comfortable retirement." Kendrick's face fell. It was a public slap. A golden parachute that was also an ejection seat. He had been dismissed. Sabrina leaned forward, unable to contain her smirk. With Kendrick out of the way, her path was clear. "And now," Finch said, his voice lowering slightly, "we come to Miss Sabrina Valenti." Sabrina's smile widened. This was her moment. Finch read to Sabrina Valenti, whose ambition I always admired, though not her methods, I leave the sum of $10 million. It was a vast sum of money, but it wasn't the kingdom Sabrina had expected. Her smile faltered. "This sum is contingent," Finch continued, his voice cold, "on the signing of a non-disclosure agreement pertaining to both her personal and professional relationship with me, and her immediate and permanent resignation from any board or position from which she might attempt to influence or acquire Davenport Innovations." The room was utterly silent. It was a payoff, a dismissal. John had paid for her services and was now showing her the door. Sabrina's face was a thunderous mask of fury. "This is absurd," she hissed. "He loved me. He was going to leave her for me. She must have manipulated him into this." Finch ignored her outburst. "And finally," he said, turning a page, "we come to the residue of the estate. This includes my entire controlling share of Davenport Innovations, all liquid assets, properties, art collections, trusts, and intellectual properties. This was it. The entire empire. Billions of dollars. The ultimate prize." Every eye in the room was on Finch. He looked directly at Audrey, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something akin to compassion in his gaze. He read the final stunning clause. "All the remainder of my estate, without exception or condition, I leave to my beloved wife, Audrey Jensen Davenport." A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Desmond and Mary Ann stared, mouths agape. Walter Kendrick looked as if he'd been physically struck. Sabrina shot to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the floor. "No!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with disbelief. "That's impossible." He hated her. He called her useless in front of 200 people last night. This is a fraud. Audrey herself was frozen in shock. Her mind was reeling. Beloved wife. The words were a cruel joke, a stark contradiction to the man who had publicly destroyed her. She felt like she was dissociating, watching a scene from a movie. She owned everything. Everything. The company, the penthouse, the fortune, the power. "The will is ironclad, Miss Valenti," Finch stated calmly, not even flinching at her outburst. "It was signed by Mr. Davenport, witnessed by 2 independent partners from my firm, and declared sound by his personal physician. I'll fight this. I will challenge it in every court. He was not of sound mind. She poisoned him against me." Sabrina raged, pointing a trembling finger at Audrey. Audrey finally found her voice, a quiet but steady anchor in the swirling chaos. "He had a heart attack, Sabrina. The only poison in his life was the world he created." "But Mr. To..." Finch wasn't finished. He held up a hand for silence. "There is one more thing," he said, his voice commanding attention. "A final addendum, a personal letter from John to be read aloud only in the event of this reading." He unfolded a separate piece of paper written not in formal legal type, but in John's own aggressive slanting handwriting. And as he began to read, everyone in the room realized that the shock of the inheritance was nothing compared to the truth that was about to be revealed. Mr. Finch adjusted his spectacles, the silence in the room so absolute that the rustle of the single sheet of paper sounded like a thunderclap. He began to read the words of John Davenport, and the voice that emerged was not of the arrogant billionaire, but of a man cornered by his own mortality. "If you are reading this," Finch began, his voice channeling the letter's somber tone, "it means my worst fear has come to pass. The doctors were right. The flaw wasn't in my ambition or my intellect, but in the very muscle that powered them. I was born with a ticking clock in my chest, a congenital heart defect that no amount of money could fix. They gave me a year, maybe 2 if I was lucky and careful. I was neither." A wave of shock rippled through the room. John Davenport, the paragon of strength and vitality, had been living under a death sentence. Audrey felt her hands tremble. He had never told her. He had carried this monumental burden alone. Finch continued reading. "I have spent my life building an empire, a legacy. But as the end grew closer, I was haunted by a single question. What is it all for? Who can I trust to protect it, to understand it? My family sees it as a bank vault to be plundered. My colleagues like Walter see it as a trophy to be won. My mistresses," and here Finch's eyes flickered for a second toward Sabrina, "see it as a shortcut to power. They were all drawn to the sun, but none of them cared for the man at its center." Sabrina sank back into her chair, her face pale. This was a public condemnation from the man she thought had adored her. And then there was Audrey. Finch read his voice, softening. "My Audrey. The quiet storm in the middle of my hurricane. I married her because she was the only person who looked at me and didn't see a dollar sign. She saw a man, and that terrified me. Her love was a genuine article in a world of fakes, and I, a master forger of my own life, did not know how to handle it." Audrey closed her eyes, tears finally beginning to well. He had seen her. He had understood. "So I decided to conduct an experiment." The letter went on, and a cold, chilling logic began to emerge. A cruel one, I admit, but it was the only way I knew. I had to know if her love was unconditional, or if she too had a price. I had to know if she was strong enough to withstand the pressures of my world if I were gone. So I began to push her away. I flaunted my affair with Sabrina, a woman whose transparent ambition was a perfect foil. I belittled Audrey's passions, calling her art, and her books useless hobbies. I wanted to see if she would break, if she would leave, if she would demand a settlement and run. It all clicked into place for Audrey. The escalating cruelty, the emotional distance, the final horrific humiliation at the gala. It hadn't been a prelude to a divorce. It had been a test, a monstrous, brutal, unforgivable test. Every day, she stayed every time she met my cruelty, not with hysterics, but with a quiet, unbreakable dignity. I fell more in love with her. Every time she showed her strength in her gentle way, I grew more certain. She was the one. She was the only one who had the integrity, the intelligence, and the fortitude to protect my true legacy. The gala was the final act. Finch read his voice, heavy with the weight of the confession. I had to make the push absolute. I had to publicly cast her out, to offer her nothing, to see if she would finally crumble. Her reaction, the way she walked out of that room, not broken but resolute, gave me my answer. She wasn't leaving me for the money. She would leave me only when I became a man she could no longer respect. She passed the test. I was going to tell her everything that night, apologize, beg for her forgiveness, spend whatever time I had left making it up to her and our child. But the clock, it seems, ran out. It is the great, tragic irony of my life. The letter ended with a final, devastating directive. Audrey, if you are listening, I am sorry. I was a fool. I loved you, and this was the only broken way I knew how to show it. The empire is yours, not as a prize, but as a tool. Inside my private safe, you will find my personal journals. They contain my real vision for the future of Davenport Innovations, a future beyond profit focused on philanthropic technology. It was a project I called the Jensen Initiative, named for you. It is my true legacy. Protect it. Build it. Be the partner I never gave myself the chance to have in life. You are not useless. You were my only hope. Mr. Finch folded the letter and placed it back on the lectern. The room was tomb silent. The narrative had been completely rewritten. John wasn't just a cruel philanderer. He was a tragic, manipulative genius, playing a high-stakes game with the people in his life. Sabrina and Walter Kendrick exchanged a dark, calculating look. The revelation of John's illness and his secret project changed everything. The will was no longer just about money. It was about a mission they now had a motive to sabotage. Audrey sat stunned, the weight of it all crashing down on her. She had not inherited a fortune. She had inherited a burden, a test and a legacy she never asked for. She was the sole guardian of the empire and the secret heart of a man she had both loved and hated. The war, she realized, was far from over. It had just been given a new, more dangerous and much more personal battlefield. The days following the will reading were not a time of quiet grief or adjustment for Audrey. They were the opening salvos of an all-out war. The story of John's secret illness and his dramatic will became the biggest news in the financial world. The initial headlines painted Audrey as a tragic, wronged widow who had been vindicated. But that narrative began to change with surgical precision. Sabrina Valenti, spurning the $10 million buyout, went on the offensive. She hired a notoriously aggressive public relations firm and a shark of a litigator. Within 48 hours, the story began to shift. Tabloid articles appeared with anonymous sources claiming Audrey was a master manipulator who had known about John's illness all along. They suggested she had played the part of the meek wife to perfection, isolating him from his true friends and influencing the will. The useless comment at the gala was reframed as John's desperate final attempt to cry for help, to signal to the world that he was being controlled. It was a brilliant, venomous campaign. Sabrina cast herself as the woman who truly understood John's power and passion, the one who was trying to save his legacy from the clutches of a schemer. Simultaneously, Walter Kendrick, furious at his dismissal, allied himself with Sabrina. He didn't resign. Instead, he used his position as CFO to sow chaos within Davenport Innovations. He held secret meetings with disgruntled board members, arguing that leaving a multi-billion-dollar tech giant in the hands of an unqualified art historian was a violation of their fiduciary duty to the shareholders. He initiated a formal motion to challenge Audrey's control, citing a key person clause in the company's bylaws that was meant to prevent exactly this kind of scenario. The siege was a two-pronged attack, a public assault on her character, and an internal corporate insurgency. Audrey felt like she was drowning. Reporters camped outside the penthouse. Her phone rang incessantly with calls from lawyers, board members, and even John's estranged siblings who were now convinced she had cheated them out of their rightful inheritance and were threatening to join Sabrina's lawsuit. She retreated into the sanctuary of John's study, the one place that felt shielded from the outside world. With Mr. Finch's help, she had the large, formidable safe opened. Inside, she found not just stock certificates and financial documents, but a stack of leather-bound journals. For 2 days, she did nothing but read. She devoured John's words, his private thoughts, spanning the last 3 years. She saw his brilliance, his fears, his loneliness. She read about the day he was diagnosed, the terror and rage he felt. He wrote about meeting her, describing her as a moment of quiet truth in a life of loud lies. She read his painful, self-aware entries about the test he was putting her through, his guilt warring with what he saw as a grim necessity. And then she found the plans for the Jensen Initiative. It was more than just a philanthropic side project. It was a complete restructuring of Davenport Innovations' core mission. John envisioned using their cutting-edge AI and logistics technology to tackle global problems, creating systems for efficient disaster relief, optimizing food distribution to famine-stricken regions, and developing predictive models for disease outbreaks. It was audacious, brilliant, and almost impossibly idealistic. It was a vision that would sacrifice short-term profits for long-term humanitarian gain. It was the complete antithesis of the ruthless profit-at-all-costs image John had projected to the world. This, she realized, was why Kendrick and Sabrina were so terrified. This wasn't just about control. It was about ideology. They wanted the company for its power and profitability. Audrey now held the plans to transform it into something they would consider an abomination. Her grief and shock began to crystallize into something new, a fierce, cold resolve. John's test had been cruel, but his faith in her had been absolute. He hadn't just left her his company. He had entrusted her with his soul. She picked up the phone and called Mr. Finch. "They think I'm weak, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice devoid of its earlier hesitation. "They think I'm the useless wife who is going to buckle under pressure. They're about to find out how wrong they are." "I was hoping you'd say that Mrs. Davenport," the lawyer replied, a hint of admiration in his tone. "What's your first move?" Audrey looked at the detailed plans for the Jensen Initiative spread across the desk. "John's memorial service is in 3 days. The entire financial world will be watching. Sabrina and Walter think it's a social obligation. I'm going to make it a declaration of intent. And what about the internal challenge from Kendrick?" Finch asked. Mr. Kendrick is a man who understands numbers, Audrey said, a glint of steel in her voice. I've been reading John's private financial notes. I think it's time we schedule an audit of the CFO's office. A very, very thorough one. The woman who bought flowers and read books was gone. In her place was the heir to John Davenport's empire, and she was finally ready to fight. The siege had been meant to break her, but instead it had forged her into a weapon. The transformation of Audrey Davenport was not a loud, sudden explosion, but a quiet, seismic shift. It began in the solitude of John's study, surrounded by his secrets, and it culminated in the full glare of the public eye. Her first move was subtle, but devastating. On the morning she requested the audit of Walter Kendrick's offer, she also leaked an anonymous tip to a respected financial journalist. The tip didn't mention embezzlement or fraud. It was far more elegant. It simply suggested an investigation into a series of off-book shell corporations that Kendrick had established for tax efficiency. John's journals had provided the names of 3. The resulting article was a masterpiece of insinuation. It raised questions about Kendrick's transparency and hinted at potential conflicts of interest. It didn't prove guilt, but it mortally wounded his credibility. The board members who had been flocking to his side suddenly grew cautious. In the world of high finance, the perception of impropriety could be as damaging as the crime itself. Walter Kendrick, the aggressor, was suddenly on the defensive, bogged down in a mire of his own complex financial architecture. Her second move was to neutralize the personal attacks. She agreed to a single exclusive interview with a veteran journalist known for her tough but fair approach. She met the journalist not in the opulent penthouse, but in the small independent art gallery owned by her friend Olivia. Surrounded by the work of emerging artists, Audrey was no longer the billionaire's widow. She was Audrey Jensen, the art historian. She spoke not of the will or the corporate battle, but of the man she had married. She shared stories from his journals, with Finch's guidance on what was legally safe, painting a picture of a complex, brilliant man tormented by his own mortality. She talked about the Jensen Initiative with such passion and detailed knowledge that it was impossible to doubt her sincerity or her intelligence. She addressed the useless comment head-on. My husband was a man who dealt in absolutes, she said, her voice calm and measured. In his world, things were either assets or liabilities. He was testing me, pushing me. It was a painful, terrible thing to endure. But he made a mistake. He failed to understand that things like love, integrity, and quiet strength aren't liabilities. They are the bedrock on which everything else is built. He learned that too late. My goal now is to build the company he wanted, not the one he felt he needed to project. The interview was a resounding success. It recast her as a thoughtful, resilient leader, the chosen custodian of a visionary's true legacy. The public, who had been swayed by Sabrina's narrative of a gold-digging manipulator, now saw a pregnant widow fighting for her husband's dying wish. The final stage of her transformation took place at John's memorial service. The grand cathedral was filled with the city's elite. Sabrina and Walter Kendrick sat in a front pew expecting a somber traditional service. What they got was a corporate takeover. When Audrey stepped up to the pulpit to give the eulogy, she did not speak of love and loss. She spoke of the future. John Davenport built an empire on the idea of disruption. She began, her voice ringing with newfound authority through the cavernous space. He disrupted markets, industries, and expectations. Today, in his memory, we will announce the greatest disruption of all. We are disrupting ourselves. She laid out the vision for the Jensen Initiative in clear, powerful terms. She announced she was immediately liquidating several of John's vanity assets, a fleet of private jets, a yacht, a collection of hypercars, and using the hundreds of millions of dollars as seed money for the new foundation. She announced a complete re-evaluation of the company's mission, shifting focus from pure profit to purpose-driven innovation. It was a eulogy that was also a business manifesto. The investors in the pews were stunned, then intrigued. The tech journalists began typing furiously on their phones. She ended with a direct challenge. "There are those," she said, her eyes sweeping over the pew where Kendrick and Sabrina sat, "who will resist this change, who will cling to the old ways, who see this company as a source of personal enrichment and power. To them I say this: Davenport Innovations is no longer your playground. Under my leadership, we will be a force for good. If you do not share that vision, the door is open. We are moving forward." She walked back to her seat. The silence in the cathedral, followed by a wave of astonished murmurs. Mrs. Gable, watching from the back, was crying tears of pride. Mr. Finch allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Sabrina and Walter were aghast. Audrey hadn't just defended herself. She had seized control of the narrative and the company's very soul in one fell swoop. She had used the platform of John's death to give birth to his legacy, and in doing so, she had been reborn herself. The quiet, useless wife was now the most powerful and unpredictable player in the game, and she had just checkmated them in front of the entire world. The memorial service was the turning point. Audrey's speech had galvanized the company's younger, more idealistic employees and attracted positive attention from a new class of socially conscious investors. Walter Kendrick, mired in his audit and publicly sidelined, found his support on the board evaporating. Sabrina Valenti's media campaign sputtered, her accusations now seeming like the sour grapes of a spurned mistress in the face of Audrey's inspiring new vision. But they were not defeated yet. They launched their final desperate gambit. Kendrick and Sabrina filed a joint lawsuit to have Audrey removed as executor and beneficiary, demanding the court place the company in a temporary conservatorship. Their legal argument was a twisted masterpiece. They claimed John's secret illness, combined with Audrey's undue influence, had rendered him mentally incompetent. They alleged that the Jensen Initiative was not a visionary plan, but the delusional fantasy of a dying man, one that would bankrupt the company. Their star witness, they claimed, was John's own physician, Dr. Alistair Finch, no relation to the lawyer who they had subpoenaed to testify about John's state of mind. The final confrontation was not a boardroom showdown, but a sterile courtroom hearing to decide on the motion for conservatorship. The fate of the empire would hang on this ruling. Audrey entered the courtroom flanked by Mr. Finch. She was now visibly pregnant, and her presence had a gravity that commanded respect. She projected an aura of calm, unshakable authority. Across the aisle, Sabrina and Walter sat with their legal team, looking tense but confident. They believed they had an ace in the hole with the doctor's testimony. Their lawyer, a man named Peterson, laid out their case. He painted a picture of John as a sick, vulnerable man, and Audrey as a cunning opportunist. "We will hear from Mr. Davenport's own doctor," Peterson boomed, "about the cognitive effects of his condition, the powerful medications he was taking. We will prove that this Jensen Initiative is a flight of fancy that proves his diminished capacity." When Dr. Alistair Finch was called to the stand, a hush fell over the court. He was an elderly, distinguished man, who looked deeply uncomfortable. Peterson began his questioning. "Doctor, you treated John Davenport for a severe congenital heart condition. Is that correct?" "Yes, for the last 18 months of his life. And this condition and the medications prescribed for it, can they have neurological or psychological side effects? Confusion? Delusions of grandeur?" "They can in some cases," the doctor conceded hesitantly. Sabrina and Walter exchanged a triumphant look. This was it. But when it was Mr. Finch's turn to cross-examine, he approached the stand with a calm, almost gentle demeanor. "Dr. Finch," he began, "you just testified that you treated Mr. Davenport for the last 18 months. But you were not his primary physician for his condition, were you?" The doctor shifted in his seat. "Well, no, I was his GP. His primary cardiologist was Dr. Lena Petrova, a specialist." "And where is Dr. Petrova?" Mr. Finch asked. "She is on a Doctors Without Borders mission in Sudan. Unreachable." "Convenient," Mr. Finch murmured before turning back. "So your knowledge of his condition is based on her reports and your general observations. You never conducted a full cognitive assessment on Mr. Davenport, did you?" "No, I did not see the need." "So you have no direct clinical evidence that he was suffering from any cognitive decline whatsoever?" "No," the doctor admitted. Mr. Finch then walked to his table and picked up a single sealed document. He handed it to the clerk to be entered into evidence. "Your Honor, this is a sworn affidavit from John Davenport, signed 1 week before his death and notarized by myself. It was created for precisely this eventuality." The judge read the document, his eyebrows raising. He nodded to Mr. Finch. "You may read a portion of it to the court." Mr. Finch cleared his throat. "I, John Davenport, being of sound mind and body, save for the faulty pump in my chest, do hereby declare the following. I am fully aware that upon my death, opportunistic parties, likely including Walter Kendrick and Sabrina Valenti, will attempt to seize control of my company by questioning my sanity. They will call my legacy project, the Jensen Initiative, a delusion. They will be wrong." He paused, letting the words sink in. Sabrina's face had gone ashen. "The Jensen Initiative," Finch continued reading John's words, "is the result of 2 years of secret research, market analysis, and logistical planning conducted with a clandestine team of my most trusted engineers, none of whom report to Mr. Kendrick. The complete 500-page business plan, with financial modeling and feasibility studies, can be found in a location known only to my wife, Audrey Davenport. It is not a fantasy. It is the most important work of my life." It was a posthumous checkmate from the Grand Master himself. John had anticipated their every move. But Audrey had one more move of her own. Mr. Finch called her to the stand. She didn't address the judge or the opposing counsel. She turned and spoke directly to Sabrina. "You said he loved you." Audrey said, her voice clear and strong, devoid of malice but full of undeniable truth. "But John didn't love you, Sabrina. He used you. You were a tool in his test, a character in his play. The $10 million he left you wasn't a gift. It was your salary. He paid you for your performance." She then turned to Walter Kendrick. "And you, Walter. You thought you were his partner, but you were just a functionary. He knew you only valued the company for its stock price. That's why he kept his real work, his most important vision, a complete secret from you for 2 years. He didn't trust you." She rose her hand on her belly and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, These are not the actions of people trying to protect a legacy. These are the actions of people who have been exposed as frauds, who were outwitted by a man they consistently underestimated, just as they underestimated me. The judge looked at the affidavit, at the defeated faces of Sabrina and Walter, and at the poised, powerful woman standing before him. "Motion for conservatorship is denied," he declared, his voice ringing with finality. It was over. Audrey walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight, a free woman. The empire was hers. The legacy was hers. The future was hers. She had been tested by a cruel, complicated man. She had been besieged by his enemies. And she had emerged not just victorious, but transformed. She was no one's decorative object. She was not useless. She was Audrey Jensen Davenport, and she was just getting started. In the end, John Davenport's greatest creation wasn't his company. It was the queen he forged in the fires of his own cruel test. Audrey's story teaches us a powerful lesson. True strength isn't always loud and aggressive. Sometimes it's the quiet resilience that endures the storm. It's the integrity that can't be bought, and the intelligence that is so often underestimated. She was dismissed as useless, but she proved that the qualities the world may not value. Empathy, quiet dignity, and a vision for a better future are the most powerful assets of all. She didn't just inherit an empire, she gave it a soul. What do you think? Was John's test a monstrous act of cruelty, or a necessary evil to find a worthy successor? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of resilience and hidden strength moved you, please give this video a like. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own power, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable, real-life stories. Thank you for listening.